Hi butterflies, welcome to my comic verse. Thank you so much for tuning in. So this is part 2 of Surrender and Sacrifice. Make sure you check out part 1 featuring Juggernaut if you haven't already. I decided to separate the videos since this is focusing on the new X-Men series, and they focus on the struggle and resistance of Surrender opposed to Juggernaut, who has learned this already. So just to recap part 1, surrender is acceptance of a situation and sacrifice is the release of anything that doesn't serve our well-being. So in this series, this topic initially starts with Storm stating that man should know when he's beaten, when to break and run or surrender and ask for unearned mercy, and yet they motherfucking don't. Okay, so they fast forward and we have the bad guys from Orcus. So they're saying there's no way I'm losing any of this information. By the way, his name is Dr. Mars, representing that left-brained way of thinking. Usually I wouldn't mention this off of just a name, but if you look at the series as a whole and the way everything revolves around celestial influences, it's not a coincidence that Atlantis has now entered the building in Magneto's issue of Giant Size X-Men. And I feel like this is all about to tie in with the battle between the Atlanteans and the Martians, which is too much to get into right now, but the Mars energy is heavily associated with the left brain way of thinking, which is another reason why the X-Force video on masculine versus feminine is such a foundational principle for the series. So in typical power struggle language, he's like, better to make the ultimate sacrifice than to surrender 1 inch to the damn mutants. So we see the mindset that follows when there's sacrifice without surrender. And there's a whole lot of that going on in the series and the world. People making large unnecessary sacrifices because they refuse to surrender. And we can even see that reflected on a smaller scale within our personal lives, right? Sometimes we're asked to surrender to our ego for love, and some people are not able to do that. So they sacrifice how they feel and the potential for love for their ego. So when we're asked to surrender and sacrifice, it's always for the greater good of both ourself and for the collective. But if we're imbalanced and lacking discernment and awareness, then people start thinking that they're making the necessary sacrifice for the greater good while hurting others. So we see that here with Orcus Forge, we see that in X-Force with Beast, and basically in every series, someone is talking about this is for the greater cause, so who cares? Including the humans. Everybody wants to do immoral things, then say it's for the greater good of their cause. Everyone has a way of justifying their perspective, even if it's wrong. But sacrifice will never ask you to hurt yourself or others in any way. It may be painful for us to let go and shed past versions. And I did do an Elektra video on shedding labels because even releasing past versions of yourself by accepting and moving on from it will free up that space into all the possibilities of who you can or who you want to be or who you already are but aren't fully connected to because you're so focused on this past version. But back to sacrifice, back in the back days, to my understanding, the concept of sacrificing the animals was because it was used for literally everything and there was value to it. So it's like saying, this is my food, this is my money, this is my shelter, this is all I have, and I'm giving it to you because I have faith that you're going to provide something greater for my sacrifice. So to do that now would make no sense, not because there's no value on the animal itself, but because it's given to us so freely, so we don't put value on it. Sacrifice is a situation where you have to step into a complete space of trust, which is surrender, as you lose something that's valuable to you because you have faith that there will always be something greater. When we lose something that is genuinely out of our control, that's realignment happening in real time. That's why as we level up, we're asked to sacrifice many relationships that don't evolve with us because the energies are no longer in alignment and our soul is seeking energies who fit the bill. So my point is that anything that causes harm is not the type of sacrifice that the universe will ever ask of us. And when that does happen, it's because there's refusal of surrender, just like Dr. Martian over here. When the feminine principle is dormant and not active in a person's mind, that's exactly what happens. It's all war, defense, power trip, control in a very imbalanced manner. So now we see how Cyclops refused to surrender, and I feel really bad for him because even though he has learned to live with his gift, he doesn't actually see it as one yet, which is also a repeating message in the series. So he speaks about how terrible he felt because his child had to suffer with the same gifts as him because of his blood, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. All he could do was endure and try not to surrender, try not to give up. He says, I held on and now we're home because I believed in a thing. So again, discernment is so important because we need to know when to keep fighting to persevere and when to surrender. Because just like Scott, a lot of us keep fighting because we genuinely think that this is all we can do. Even Juggernaut mentions something about not knowing when to stop, indicating how difficult it was for him to surrender in his own process. So that's another thing about Krakoa, is that it represents so much hope that many of the mutants are blinded to the full scope because they're so eager for this new life, which is very relatable, right? How many of us have jumped into something blindly because we're so excited after long periods of darkness, pain, or just stagnancy? And I feel like that's the space that Scott is in. This all stems from his inability to accept, to surrender to who he is in nature. And of course, he's not going to be able to teach self-acceptance and self-love to his son properly, even if he tries, because it's not reflected in who he is. So in Scott's case, and the mutants and all of us, there's always something about ourselves that we dislike that we have to just accept or surrender to, and often it becomes our gift in some way. Just like artists who have been made fun of their voice growing up because it's so different, but when they sing or rap, it's dope and distinct and it's their gift. So Scott is fighting an endless battle because he's fighting himself. So the lesson here is to accept who you are and all of who you are. So the last example is in issue 7, where they're doing this thing called crucible. So when the mutants die, they're reborn as quote unquote a better version of themselves, which we all know by now that it's all going downhill because it's actually fragmenting their memories and disconnecting them further and further from self. So they battle until Apocalypse decides, okay, you've earned this gift of death, and kills her for rebirth. And Apocalypse says, we don't accept those simply killing yourself to be reborn as something better. It's a surrender, and those days are beyond our people. This is where it starts tying in with religion again. They're supposedly a sovereign nation of their own, but there's a lot of familiar footsteps being repeated that mimic religion, right? And that's something of a warning when you step into being spiritual or sovereign, because we're creatures of habit. So if you've already been in the habit of following a system, then that can happen in the spiritual community just alike. So of course they shouldn't be killing themselves for rebirth, but it's just amplifying this massive resistance against surrender that everyone is experiencing. Even in issue 8, when the brutes come attacking, they're like, these queens will sacrifice everything to hold on to their power. So what's the difference between the broods, the parasites, the humans, and anyone who's forcefully trying to claim their power? That's the masculine energy without the feminine principle, which is inside all of us, and it allows for surrender because it's wise enough to know that it benefits us in the long run. The feminine principle is powerful because it doesn't give a flying fuck about what you think. Truly, if you look at it as heart versus brain, the brain might overthink, try to rationalize what's happening, and be self-conscious, get too caught up with labels and worry about how they look, all this mental work. But the heart is like the eternal child. The heart wants what it wants. So when we're acting and speaking through our heart space and genuinely tuned in with it, we don't chase power because we are power. So what need is there to control or force? Those are the two poisons of power. We see it play out in politics, in our economy, and in our relationships, and everything. And this doesn't mean literal chasing either, because even the resistance to surrender or acceptance is a form of chasing power. Resistance to surrender can be a form of chasing power. So the heart's wisdom knows that there's strength in our ability to surrender and to flow to where we're actually meant to be, even if we can't visibly see it or feel it in any way. Because that's harder than fighting sometimes, because it means giving up our ego. It means truly having faith when you can't see what's ahead. There are people who will literally die before surrendering to their ego, and a lot of people do internally. But the magic of the heart, when you accept a defeat or a loss gracefully, when you finally stop gripping onto water, your real self will always lead you to an empowered position. A main reason why things get snatched away from us is because we often make moves with our brain and our brain only. And if we stray away from what our soul and what our heart wants, you better believe that things will come crashing down so that you follow your heart, as Juggernaut had to do, okay? So that's the inverted side of surrender and sacrifice. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you guys find the strength to surrender to anything that is out of your control, but especially to who you are, so that you can embrace your true self and be empowered towards the most authentic path for you. Thank you, butterflies, so much for spending your time with me today. Stay flying free, and I'll see you next time. Bye.